Lekutu Siches Chelek Tesvov Lech Lecha Hey Nishmas Rabbi Yosef Ben Yamin Ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. What an absolutely fascinating sicha. One that is going to come from the Nigla perspective. We're going to speak about the ownership of Eretz Yisrael, about the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, and how B'hashgacha Pratis, how appropriate it is to the time that we are in, as the Rebbe lays down the foundation of our halachic ownership of Eretz Yisrael, and the fact that the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael can never be, at least from Ezra and on, can never be questioned or uprooted. Let's do this. In Parshas Lech Lecha gefindt man kama Palmen die Avtache von dem Ebersten zu Avram, als wird ihm und seine Kinder geben Eretz Yisrael. Parshas Lech Lecha, there's a number of references to the promise that the Eberster makes, that God Almighty makes to Avram, that Hashem will give to Avram and to his children the land of Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe brings a number of examples. In Anfang Sadr steht, Yeda Hashem al Avram, Vayemer lezaracha etin es Eretz hazeh. Hashem revealed himself to Avram, and he said, to your offspring I will give this land. Danach beim Weggehen von Mitzrayim, wenn Lot hat sich von ihm abgescheit. Later there's a story that they come back from Mitzrayim, and Avram and Lot get into some disagreement, and they decide to separate one from another. After that, the Eibishter reveals himself to Lot, to Avram, and says, Ki eskal ha'aretz asher ata roya, lecha etnena ulazaracha adaylam. This entire land that you see, I will give it to you and to your offspring for eternity. Another pasuk, kum hisalich ba'aretz la'arka u'lerachba ki lecha etnena. Rise up and walk along this land to its length and to its breadth, because I will be giving it to you. These three psukim, if you will notice, all use the term etain, as in give, and in the future tense, I will give. And then by the Bris ben Absarim, the covenant that Hashem made with Avraham, when he has to walk between the parts, the pasuk says, "Bayemahu karas Hashem es Avram bris leimer." On that day, Hashem made a covenant with Avram to say, "Lezaracha nosati es Eretz hazeh," to your children I gave. And notice here it's in the past tense. This land, minahar Mitzrayim adanor agadol nahar pras, from the Nile River until the big river, the Euphrates. When the weiter the kipsukim werden ausgerechnet alle eser umes, and then the 10 different nations that ultimately Avram's children will conquer are all mentioned in the pasuk. Now, if we look at these various different promises that the Eibishter makes, we will see a very general difference. The first two that are mentioned, which are belashon asid, that are said in the future tense, did not come as part of or in connection to anything that Avram did or said. Hashem said, there was nothing that came from Avram's end. Hashem came to Avram and said, I'm going to give you the land. But the one that by the Bris ben Absarim, when Hashem says, I gave you this land in the past tense, is gekumen nachdem vi Avram is gegangen l'orka l'rachba. This happens after two things on the part of Avram. Number one, after Avram fulfilled the request of Hashem and walked the length and the breadth of the land. Then Hashem says to him, in addition to that, this was in continuation to the previous statement. I want to give you this land to inherit it. And in response to Avram's question, how will I know? What's the proof that I will inherit this land? So first of all, Avram did something. He walked the length and the breadth of the land. Number two, Avram had asked a question. Hashem said, I'm going to give you this land. And Avram asked a question. Avram asked something. And to that, the Eibishter responds, Lizaracha nosati. This case, it's in the past tense. So the general difference is that some psukim, in the earlier part of the parsha, they're written belashon asid, in the future tense, and they're not a response to anything that Avram does or says. and then later at the Bris Ben Absarim, it says that Nosati Lashon Avar in the past tense, and it is in reaction to or after something that Avram does and that Avram says. Now, the Rogatchover is Mevarim Tam Fachilak Lashenus. The Rogatchover addresses a different difference. That you'll notice that the third time, which was mentioned, not in the second paragraph, but in the third paragraph, the bottom of this first column, the lashon pasuk is the Rebishter had genutzt the lashon lerishta, to inherit. Und Avram gefragt the lashon b'makir Hashena. Avram asks Hashem says, I'm going to give it to you lerishta, to inherit, and Avram asks, how will I know that I will inherit? So we see the lashon Yerusha. Mashiach in the lashon in the friedige psukim is lezaracha etin lecha etnena. So the Rogatchover focuses not on the difference of avar and asid, but on the difference of the fact that later on the lashon is lerishta, a lashon Yerusha, inheritance, and earlier on the lashon is etin or etnena, to give. Ados einen zwei fanim in the meibishten's geben von Eretz Eden. And the Rogatchover explains that this is two different manners in which the Eibishter gave Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden. There's Begeder Matana and Begeder Yerusha. The Eibishter gave Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden as a gift and as a present, and the Eibishter gave Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden as an inheritance. Und as das ist bechlolus der Unterschied zwischen Kibush Rishon and Kibush Sheni. And the Rogatchover continues to say that this is the difference between the first time the Yidden enter into Eretz Yisrael in the time of Yeshua, and the second time they go to Eretz Yisrael in the time of Ezra after the 70 years of Galus Bavel. The Kibush Rishon is Begeder Matana. The first time the Yidden went into Eretz Yisrael and they conquered Eretz Yisrael, this was given to them as a Matana. Geder Nekuda, Kol Eretz Yisrael. A matana is a package deal. You get the whole thing. You don't break it down and you say, okay, I'm going to give you half a gift. When you give someone a gift, you give them the entire thing. Umiktzis leiklum. And if you give just part of it, it's as if nothing. Either you give the gift or you don't give. Under Kibush Sheni, the second time they didn't go into Eretz Yisrael, and really, as we'll see later, it wasn't a kibush. So it's interesting that it uses the term kibush over here. But it's referring to the second time they enter into Eretz Yisrael, have a Geder Yerusha. This wasn't just a gift, this time it was an inheritance, and therefore Vegam Miktzes, and therefore this can apply even to part of it. Just like by a Yerusha, if there's more than one heir, then the inheritance is divided amongst the heirs. So the Rogatchover explains that there is two types of giving. One is a gift, one is an inheritance, and this would break itself down. The first time they went to Eretz Yisrael, it was matana. The second time they went into Eretz Yisrael, it was a Yerusha. Alpize is Musber der Chile Kanal zwischen die erste zwei Avtachis und der Avtacha by Bris Ben Absarim. And with this, we can also explain why there is sometimes in the lashon of avar and sometimes in the lashon of why sometimes use the words nosati, nesina, and sometimes use the words Yerusha. The kibush from the Knisa Shniya, welches given noch dem Matze from Umipnei Chatinu Galinu Martzenu, when they went in the second time after they had sinned and been exiled from their land. Is merumas in the Rav Tachabam Krisas Bris Lazaracha Nosati. This is alluded to in the promise by the Bris Ben Absarim, which says over there, I gave it to you, to your children. Which is compared to the second entry. After Avram says, how will I know that I inherited? And Chazal tell us, our sages tell us that this was considered like a sin for the fact that Avram questioned Hashem. Is given der Ansag of Golus. And we see, as a matter of fact, the connection between the fact that the second entry to Eretz Yisrael comes after Golus is connected to the fact that in the second part of the parasha of Bris Ben Absarim, actually Golus is mentioned, where Hashem tells Avram that his children are going to go into Golus. which was referring to Galus Mitzrayim, and Euch is again if of Galus Bavel und the andere Galius, which the Galus Mitzrayim, there is over there an allusion to the other Galius, including Galus Bavel. So we see the connection between Umipnei Chatenu Galinu Me'artzenu and the pasuk is Lecha Nasati. Number one, because Avram did somewhat of a sin by asking B'ma'eda, and number two, because it discusses Galus in that promise. But the first kibbutz through Yeshua, once again, the erste Knisset is the first entry into Eretz Yisrael. Is merumas the erste Sveavtachas when the Rebbeinu is alluded to in the first two promises, nit als hemshech to Silas Avram, not as a continuation to Avram's question. Nor was the Rebbeinu hat zugesagt mit Zadatzme. Something that came from Hashem. Al derech zeichen bei der dem zweiten Dingen, was die Avtachal ist erachar, das hatte sie kommen nachdem wie Avram ist gegangen in Larkel Rachba. The other thing we mentioned is that the second time around, number one, Avram walked the land. Number one, here we're going to in the other direction, but number one, Avram asked the question of Ma'ideh Kirashena, and number two, Avram walked the land. Also here, you see a connection between Avram walking the land and the second entry into Eretz Yisrael, the entry in the time of Ezra. Is mefurish and Targum Yonason. Targum Yonason explains, as the smeint avad b'ches kasa, by Avram walking the land, he made a chazaka. A chazaka is a legal transaction by taking possession or symbolizing possession in some way. One of the ways would be to dwell in it. But in this case, by Avram walking the land, Avram was making a chazaka, showing ownership of the land. And this is also the concept of chazaka, is also the difference or the advantage of the second entry. And the Rambam explains this. The first kedusha, the first entry into Eretz Yisrael, which brought about the first sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, because it was conquered. But once Eretz Yisrael was taken from the Yidden who conquered the land, this cancels out the conquering, the conquest. And the Eretz became potter from tithing and from the Shemitah from the sabbatical year, because it wasn't considered Eretz Yisrael anymore. When Ezra went up to Eretz Yisrael and consecrated the land, he didn't do so through conquering, it was through taking possession of it. And therefore, says the Rambam, any part of Eretz Yisrael that those who came up from Bavel took possession of, and therefore became holy through this second entry with Ezra, is still holy till this very day. And even though the land was taken from them, nevertheless the sanctity remains. And the owner of that part of the land would be obligated to bring to fulfill the mitzvah of Shvius and to bring Maisvis. So we see from over here that the difference. So let's break it down. Number one, we have Ova, Osid, and Ovar. That there's Etin and Etnena and Lazaracha Nasati. Number two, we have the fact that in the first two psukim come from Hashem directly without anything done on Avram's part. And number two, the second time around, Avram has to walk the land, and he says, B'ma'ida ki Yirashena. The Rogatchover explains that in the beginning it uses the Lashon Matana, later it uses the Lashon Yerusha, and he says this is referring to Kibush Rishon with Yeshua and the Kibush Sheni in the time of Ezra. And in addition to that, we see that by the second time they go in, Avram says, Avram says B'ma'eda, which is al derech a sin, and there's a mention of Galus. While in the first Kibush, this is representing the fact that the Eibishter gave it on his own without anything coming from below. In addition to that, we now look at the Kibush versus Chazaka, that the first entry was through Kibush, and therefore it was not forever, was not permanent, and the second kibush, second entry was through chazaka, and therefore it is permanent. And the Rebbe is now going to try to analyze and understand the Rambam a little bit better. But dafür wir verstehen, was die Scheiches von ersten Kibush, was sein Kedusha hat sich aufgetan durch Kibush, zum Teichelin von Matana, und von zweiten Kibush, was geschossen ist, genau der Chazaka und das Teichel von Yerusha. Earlier on, we explained that we said that there was a Matana and a Yerusha. That's what the Rogatchover said. The Rambam says that it was Kibush versus Chazaka. What's the connection between Kibush and Matana? And what's the connection between Chazaka and Yerusha? It seems to be two totally differentiations, and somehow they have to connect with each other. And this is the Rebbe's question. Basically, we're trying to connect the Rambam and the Rogatchover. In order to understand this, the Rebbe is going to bring on other questions on the Rambam, try to answer those questions on the Rambam, refute those answers, and then the Rebbe is going to come in with a incredible explanation that'll shed light on all of this, and at the same time explain to us that even al pi halacha there is this deep internal connection between a Yid and Eretz Yisrael. In order to explain this, we have to first understand the Rambam a little better. In Lecha the Kesef Mishnah and the Kesef Mishnah, one of the commentators on the Rambam asks two questions. Aleph, I don't understand, why is Chazaka more powerful than Kibush? Why can't we say the same thing by Chazaka? That after we took possession of the land, if the land is taken from us and we're not in possession of it anymore, then our Chazaka ends and it's not ours anymore. Just like we said by Kibush, that if I conquered the land and then it was taken away from us, I lost the conquest, and it's not Eretz Yisrael anymore. Why can you say this thing about Chazaka? That I have the Chazaka and then I lost the Chazaka. Base. The second question is from the other direction. Number two, this first time that it became holy through kibush, through conquest. Was there no chazaka? Once they conquered it, then they moved in. When they moved in, that's a chazaka. Is chazaka without conquest any stronger than chazaka with conquest? The Rambam is saying that the first time around there was a kibush, a conquest. The second time there was a chazaka. There was a taking possession. But the first time also they ended up taking possession after they conquered it. So why is that any worse than the chazaka without kibush? So it's known that there's various different explanations in the words of the Rambam. The Aleph, the first one is from the Radvaz. The Radvaz is also a commentator on the Rambam. Says the Radvaz that what the Rambam means is that in the time of Yeshua, they did not actually say the words that they were making Eretz Yisrael holy, they were sanctifying Eretz Yisrael. In the time of Ezra, there was some sort of ceremony in which they proclaimed verbally that they were elevating and sanctifying and consecrating Eretz Yisrael. First of all, says the Rebbe, we don't see that anywhere. There's no source to this. There's nowhere where we see clearly that in the time of Ezra they did sanctify it with words. In addition to this, the Rambam makes no mention of this or no allusion to this. The Rambam is mevayer befeirush. Ados was kedusha shniya lei batla is nit val kitshua bepeh. Nor val kitshua bekibush al chazaka sheichziku ba. Mashei kedusha rishayna was given al yedei kibush. The Rambam clearly explains the difference in the Rambam's opinion. That the difference is that here there was a kibush and here there was a chazaka. Rambam says nothing like kitshua bepeh and clearly says there was a different reason. So how can you say that this is the explanation? Beis etas yantiv. The second way is the Tesis Yom Tov. For then, for the Kesef Mishnah, he comes to answer the question of the Kesef Mishnah. The Rambam holds that the conquest by the nations can come and uproot the conquest of the Yidden. But the second time around, where they took chazaka not through kibush, not through conquering, but because they were given permission by the king of Persia, who at the time was the ruler of Eretz Yisrael, and he gave them permission to take possession of it. So if someone else comes, another nation comes and conquers it from them, that cannot overpower the chazaka, the possession that was taken with permission from the giver. So that's how he's mechalek. The question was, hear this kibush, hear this chazaka, hear this chazaka. He says, no, this chazaka was based on a kibush, and therefore it's weaker, because if another kibush comes and uproots the chazaka, then there's no more chazaka. The second chazaka was done through permission from the person who was giving it to them, or at least who thought he was giving it to them, and therefore it's a different type of chazaka. Aber Lecha is nicht vereinfacht bei der Kasser says the Rabbi that doesn't answer the questions. But again, the first question of the Kesef Mishnah, which was, why is Chazaka any better than Kibush? If a Gentile nation comes and conquers the land through a battle, if that works for them to acquire the land away from us and uproots our previous ownership, so why does it change how we got it in the first place? If we're focusing on the fact that another nation can come and take the land from us, why does it matter how we got it? If they could make a kinyan, if they could take ownership of it, then why does it matter how we got it? And the second question of the Kesef Mishnah, which was that we also had Chazaka the first time around. If Chazaka is so powerful, we had Chazaka the first time around. So here's another question. Even by Yeshua, in some of the parts of Israel, it was given to them. The Noisen, the giver, gave them permission. And the Rabbi brings the example. The Givainim was a certain group of people that sort of tricked Yeshua and the people to make a covenant with them that they won't destroy them, and in that place they will willingly give them the land. And in the end, because they had made this promise, that's actually what happened. Yeshua didn't destroy them, and they gave the land to Eretz Yisrael. Here, they gave it willingly. The Afaf Kenes that I'm not mechalek bei Mokim leMokim. Und sagt man again ganz Eretz Yisrael. Kivish Lech Haaretz mit dem Batal Kibush von Nifter Minateris Minatera Mimaisas from Mishvis. But the Rambam doesn't differentiate and say, oh, there's certain parts that came al Yidei Chazaka, and therefore they're ours forever, including Trumas and Maisis, including Maisis and Shvis. And some part that doesn't differentiate between this part and that part. Even the part of the Givainim, which was given to the Yidden willingly, also the Rambam includes that in the part of Eretz Yisrael. So if the difference is whether it was given willingly or not, then there's parts of Israel that even the first time around that were given willingly, and the Rambam does not identify that or distinguish that. So this answer of the Teisas Yamtiv, that the difference is whether it was given with permission or was taken against their will, does not seem to answer the questions of the Kesef Mishnah. It might answer the question what the difference is, but the Kesef Mishnah had two questions, neither of which are properly answered through this approach. The Teisas Yamtiv then continues. And you can't ask a question, why are you saying that by the second time they went into Eretz Yisrael, it was given to them willingly by the king of Paras, and the first kibush was different? By the first kibush, Hashem gave it to them. It's also a nesina, midas hanoisen. So why was it any different than when the king of Persia gave it to them? She asked the Hashu because you could answer back, because the first time around, the Eibush Ataka gave it to the Yidden. But the Eibish's Nevi'im, the Eibish's prophets, prophesied that the destroyers will come and take it from the Yidden. And then they also prophesied that Kodesh, the king of Persia, is going to give it back. So therefore, the same Eibishter that promised it also took it back. So that doesn't count. But the fact that then we will then take it away from them, we don't find any nevuah. The fact that after we went in, after Kodesh gave it to us, then it was taken away from us by the Romans, that we don't find any nevuah about that. And therefore it's considered that they didn't have permission to do so, and you can't steal karka, you can't just rob it. It remains ours even if you move in on it. So says the Teisas Yantiv that the fact that the Eibishter promised that he's going to give it to us, that doesn't count, so to speak, because he also promised to take it from us, and he also promised he's going to give it back to us. So the fact that the Eibishter is giving it to us, that happened by both. What didn't happen the second time around is that there was no permission from the Eibishter to take it from us. But this still doesn't answer the question. If we accept that conquering through a war, a conquest, is something that can uproot a previous ownership, says Akinyan Gomer Al Pidin is my community me gefinnen an nevuah of their kibbutz or nicht. Why does it matter whether there's a prophecy about it? Either you take or you can't take ownership of it. If going to Milchama and taking over a land, conquering a land works, then just like it worked the first time, it should work the second time. And if the meaning of the Teisas Yamtiv is that a Gentile nation cannot conquer cannot take ownership through conquest. When a Jesus if dem kibush nachrim kibush sheni is nit given ki nevuah is Chelek din dat luah und ist noch doch nit shaykh der ganze nicht von kibush Milchama. Moshe ein kein Nebuchadnezzar vekedes was al pi Hashem kavshu is a ra shah haisel lahem nikna bekibush. And if you're going to say that generally speaking a Gentile nation cannot acquire through conquest, but in the case of Nebuchadnezzar and Kodesh, they had a specific permission, and that's why they were able to take it from us. This doesn't fit with the Rambam. The Rambam is the Tama Chilek, the Mitvas, the Kedusha. The Shein is given durch Kibush, and the Kedusha Shnei durch Chazaka. The Rambam doesn't go into the fact whether there was a prophecy or there wasn't a prophecy. The Rambam says the first time there was only a Kibush, and the second time there was a Chazaka. Which means that Rambam is focusing on how the Yidden got it. But according to the Teisas Yantiv, it doesn't matter how the Yidden got it. What matters is whether the guy who took it away from them had permission. Because according to Teisas Yantiv, even if the Yidden had made a chazaka, still Nebuchadnezzar had permission to take it away. And the second time around, according to Teisas Yamtiv, even if it was only kibush, it still wouldn't work. Even if the Yidden gained it through kibush, it wouldn't. Still, the other guy can't take it away because they had no permission from Hashem. So the Teisas Yamtiv is basing it on whether the nation that took it away from us had permission from Hashem or not. That's not what the Rambam says. So we still have to understand the Rambam. What does the Rambam mean that the first time was kibush and the second time was chazaka? First of all, why is kibush any better than chazaka? And number two, also by the first kibush there was chazaka as well, which are the two questions of the Kesef Mishnah. But again, the zweite Shaila Hanal, weil man the Cherige can't answer it. So the Rebbe suggests an answer which the Rebbe is going to refute. The second question, which was that also by the first kibush there was a chazaka. So on this you could answer, seemingly. And some other commentators actually explain this in the Rambam. Even though when Yeshua conquered the land there was also chazaka, but the Yidden didn't acquire it through chazaka, because their intent was to conquer it through kibush, through conquering, to take ownership through conquering. And therefore their chazaka didn't accomplish anything. In other words, these Mefarshim explain that it's about intent. When you're being kainah with chazaka, there has to be an intent that I'm going to be kainah through chazaka, which didn't happen because over there they were trying to do it through kibush. And we could learn this from the din that if somebody weeds in the field that belongs to a ger that died, so a ger that dies and he has no relatives, his property becomes hefker, ownerless. Now, if somebody went in on that property thinking that it was their own, not the ger's, and they weeded, which is one of the ways to make a chazaka, he's not kaina. He cannot acquire the land through that. Why? Because since Because since he didn't intend with that action to make a chazaka, because he thought it was his, therefore what he did has no relevance with regards to ownership. Similarly, we could say in this case, since they were not intending to take ownership through chazaka, therefore the chazaka doesn't work. Aber nesav dem tzadachiyun. See, that's as far as atanart binyanenu. Die Balas benitten die dann ist da kavana liknes. Nur will keine sein mit der zweiten kinyan. First of all, can we make this comparison? In the case of the ger, there was no intent at all to acquire, because he thought it was his already. So therefore it doesn't work. In this case, they were trying to acquire it. It's just they were trying it through various different methods. So maybe we could say that since they intended to, they knew it wasn't theirs and they're trying to acquire it, then even if they didn't intend to acquire it with the specific act, it could still work. But in addition to that issue, it's fair as it's learning canal. But the Gourarie gewähnt mit doch lieber hebt nicht gewähnt kein Kind von Kibbutz Milchama. Weil die gewähnt haben sie weggegeben mit Zeinem. Halt, was ist echt was die steht nicht halt gewähnt die Kind Chazaka von Eden. Because in addition to the fact that we don't know if this comparison works, like we explained in the first half of the paragraph, we go back to the Givainim. The Givainim gave the field to gave the land to the Yidden without any kibbutz, without a conquest. And therefore, it would mean that when they made chazaka, they obviously were making the chazaka with the purpose of acquiring the land. And yet, we don't find anywhere in the Rambam to differentiate and say, "Oh, over there is different." Obviously, it's not about the fact that they did not intend to make a chazaka through ownership, because here they would have. So this brings us back to the questions of the Kesef Mishnah. We have to understand the Rambam, and hopefully by understanding the Rambam, we'll also understand the connection between Yerusha and Matana, as the Rogatchover explains. In Sif Hey, the Rebbe is going to begin the beer, and right away, the Rebbe is going to lay down a foundation that is revolutionary and will change our entire approach to this discussion of the ownership of the Yidden. When the Eibishter gave Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden, there were two different elements that were being accomplished. Aleph, der Kinyan Moment, that says the Bailus of Eretz Yisrael, das was he belonged to Yidden. Number one, there was a financial, so to speak, a financial transaction. The fact that the Yidden owned the land, based at Inyan for Kedushas Haaretz, and then a second thing was that there was a sanctity, a holiness to Eretz Yisrael. And these two things are not intertwined, as we're going to see in the Sikha. The bailos, the ownership of Eretz Yisrael, belongs to the Yidden, regardless of whether they're there or they're not there, and regardless of whether the land is holy and chayiv and maises and shvius or not. The bailos is one thing. It's connected, but it's not the same thing as Kedusha. The Bailus, the ownership, because Hashem sets with Avram. As the Shalmi teaches, that the Eibishter says, I gave it in the past tense. It was already given. Even the says as fun demot on. Even before they conquered Eretz Yisrael. Geheret Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden avständig. The Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Yidden for eternity. And it even has a halachic ramification. The Gemara tells us that the daughters of Slavchad took their father's estate. He was Slavchad was a b'chair, and therefore he received pishnayim. He received a double portion, and his daughters inherited that double portion. Even though the halacha is that when a b'chair takes the double portion, it's only something that's already in his father's possession, but not something that potentially his father is going to get. For example, if his father made an investment and they didn't get back the return from the investment, and then the father passed away. So even though later on there's going to be much more money that's going to come in from this investment, but that's roi, that's potential. It's not in the ownership of the father, and therefore the will not get pishnayim. He only gets pishnayim. He only gets double portion from what's already in the father's estate. Nevertheless, we find that when he came to Eretz Yisrael, Slavchad got a double portion of Yisrael, but Eretz Yisrael muchzekesi, because Eretz Yisrael was considered in the ownership of the Yidden. and therefore it wasn't beroi, it wasn't potentially in their ownership, even though they weren't. In the time of Slavchot, they hadn't even entered into Eretz Yisrael yet, and nevertheless, he received a double portion. But the zweite Ringen, the Kedusha von Eretz Yisrael. But the second concept, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, Miyuchad l'chiva mitzvahs, especially to become obligated in mitzvahs, hat sich erst aufgetan durch Eden, wenn sie sind in Eretz Yisrael. Only it becomes activated once the Yidden enter into Eretz Yisrael. And then the Rebbe explains. In the way for me, and if we're talking about going into Eretz Yisrael, if it's about ownership is not connected to going into Eretz Yisrael. But if we're going to talk about going in, we find a difference in the different types of going in. By the Knisa Rishena is given that Tziratzin with Tzivui. The first time around, the Eibishter wanted and therefore commanded Chalutzim Tavru go in armed. V'yatem Tavru Chamushim L'fnei Achechem Kol Geberei Achayel, and you, all of the soldiers should go in fully armed. The land should be conquered before you. The Eibishter said, how do you get in? Because you have to go to war. And therefore the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael was dependent on the conquering, because that's what Eibishter said. This is already. Please move on. Was the Kinyan Chazaka did geholfen and filled by Arya Given Magam says Chazaka Midas and this is why the Chazaka didn't help, even though the Kesamisha says there was also a Chazaka. And the Rebbe had pointed out by the Givonim, even according to the Tesis Yamtiv, who says you need a Chazaka Midas and by the Givonim there was a Chazaka Midas and the giver gave it willingly, and yet we don't count it as a chazaka. Why? But the kedusha, because the kedusha is dependent on the Eibishter's commandment. Can chazaka it, which was to go to war. Can chazaka it pales on the chaleis kedusha. Excuse me. So the chazaka cannot activate the kedusha. Because the commandment of Hashem was that it has to be done through war. The Yisei Mizu. Additionally, since the words the Eibishter uses is, it says haaretz, the land, haaretz stam, not kol haaretz, the whole land, but it says the land is Yisleimar. It's gleich by Kibbutz Yerichai. Was ist gewesen Nagar Shel Eretz Yisrael? Und darüber in this council it says sein weil ihm nicht besser Yerichai min kat kol haaretz nicht beshes. Yerichai was like the symbol and the entry point of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore all of the nations were in there because they were trying to protect it. Because once they break through Yerichai, it's as if the whole Eretz Yisrael is conquered. Once they conquered Yerichai, it's as if the entire land was conquered, and that's when the Kedusha is activated. Durch Bias Yisrael, in Eretz Yisrael, b'Vil Kibush. But when the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael through conquering, through conquest. There were certain mitzvahs that the Eibishter specifically said that there has to be, in addition to conquest, also has to be the division of the land. From the mitzvahs, for example, mitzvah of Yevel. Das ist aber nicht an ihnen, was kommt zu in Kedushas Aretz. Das ist geworden, beständig take up a kibbutz shlichai. That's when the chiyuv of the mitzvah, the obligation of the mitzvah begins. For some of them, there had to be after an additional 7 years of dividing Eretz Yisrael. But the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael began once they conquered Yerichai, because that's when the kibush was done, and the Eibishter said that the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is dependent on kibush, specifically on conquering the land. And according to this, we can give another explanation why chazaka didn't work. Because the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, it was done by when Yerichai was conquered. So this is before they took the Givonim. This is before they took anything else. There was no chazaka on the land besides for Yerichai. So you can't say that it was done through chazaka, because even though later there was a chazaka, but that's not what triggered the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. If you said they had to conquer the whole land, then you could say by conquering it that was making chazaka. But here by saying this extra nakuda that once the Eibishter commanded it should be done through kibush, then it was activated at the conquest of Yerichai. then it was even before the Yidden took chazaka of the rest of the land. So obviously it wasn't the chazaka that was doing it, even by the Givonim, because they weren't there yet. Meaning to say, when they conquered Yericho, the Yidden already took ownership of, not the ownership, the kedusha of the land of the Givonim already started, because v'nichbus shaharetz was done, even though chazaka wasn't done. However, when it comes to the second entry into Eretz Yisrael in the time of Ezra, I will remember you to bring you back to this place. Is that in Pekida from the Eibishter given what the Eibishter wanted, but he remembered them. Not that they should conquer it, nor they should go up and settle there. Therefore, in that case, what did the Eibishter want? They want them to settle the land. They didn't want kibush, and therefore the kedusha that is accomplished in that time period is a kedusha that is done through chazaka. So this is the Rebbe's beer, that until Sif Hey, we were going back and forth between ownership. I could take ownership through chazaka. I could take ownership through kibush, and therefore we couldn't figure out why chazaka doesn't work here. Why is kibush better here? So first of all, he says, when it comes to ownership, this is not a discussion. Not kibush, not chazaka. Ownership is because the Eibishter gave it to the Yidden. End of story. The kedusha, for that you needed the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael. The first time around, the Eibishter said kibush, so therefore the kedusha is dependent on kibush. Second time around, the Eibishter said chazaka, and therefore the kedusha is dependent on chazaka. Now the Rabbi is going to spell out how this answers the questions of the Kesef Mishnah. This answers the first question of the Kesef Mishnah. The first question of the Kesef Mishnah was that why is chazaka any better than kibush? Why can we say that even after we have a chazaka in the land, but once the other nations took it away from us, we lost our chazaka? Since the kedusha, the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, was accomplished through Yeshua's fulfilling the commandment of Hashem to conquer, was together from kibush kipshuta is was menemt azach ben tzeit neged ritzonai, which conquest on the most simplest way means you're taking something from the other person against their will. Kum toch ois as mitzad atzivoy is the frier di bailus from the umas from the kedusha is verbunden mit der isgabros of the umas durch kibush. So this means that the bailus of the umas and which they had. So let me read this again. Kumtach ois as mitzad atzivoy is the frier die bailus von die umas und die kedusha is verbunden durch mit des gabros of the umas. Und der kibush und gearts mit dem battle kibush, weil es wird battle des gabros alle umas, wird battle die kedusha was kommt durch them. This taking of this kedusha is dependent on being stronger than the nations. So therefore once that strength over the nation ends, because they took the land back from us, so now the kedusha ends. Is the vollständige Beiles am Achzik, als die Sache seine und nicht, als sie es geworden, seine durch Zunehmen die Beiles von der Zweiten. Just like the idea of chazaka. It's not focusing on the fact that I'm taking it for someone else. It's focusing on the fact that it's mine. Says, moving ich bin der Kedusha, was hat sich aufgetan durch der chazaka. Als ich allein sage, Kedusha damals ist verbunden damit, was sie haben sich umgekehrt in Land, was gehört zu ich fahre der Kibbutz Yeshua, und der Fahrer wird das nicht bottle. Similarly, when it comes to the Kedusha, if the Kedusha is dependent on my strength, then if my strength dissipates, then I lose the Kedusha. The second time, it's not about the Kedusha. It's about recognizing a pre-existing ownership. And if once I recognize that pre-existing ownership, then it's mine forever. Even if they're stronger than me later, it doesn't matter. I already fell back, so to speak, on the bailus that was mine all along. I make the chazaka there, and therefore, even if you take it away from me, it doesn't matter, because the bailus is mine anyways, and therefore the kedusha remains. When Ezra goes up to Eretz Yisrael, the ownership affects the kedusha. Just like the ownership of Eretz Yisrael never changes, it remains even when we're exiled, but it's still Artseinu, it's still our land. Similarly, the Kedusha that is connected to that ownership never ends. So this answers the first question: Why is Chazaka better than Kibush? It's not Chazaka is better than Kibush. It's what the Eibishter wanted was the Kedusha should be Eladei Kibush, should be through his Gabrus, through becoming stronger than the enemy. So when we're not stronger than the enemy, then the Kedusha is not there. But the second time around, we were falling back on our pre-existing ownership because we were just revealing and reinforcing our ownership. That's what gave the Kedusha. And because that ownership never ends, even if we're not there, therefore that Kedusha never ends. And this is the answer to understand the questions that the Kesef Mishnah asked. And the same thing is, if you look at the second question of the Kesef Mishnah, he says the first round there was also a Chazaka. Why didn't the Chazaka work? And this is answered as well very clearly. Even though there was a Chazaka, it didn't make a difference because the Eibishter's commandment was Kibush, that the Kedusha should come through conquest, and therefore the fact that there was a Chazaka didn't change anything, because as soon as the other nations overpowered the Yidden, the Kedusha went away. And with this Nekuda to separate Bailus and Kedusha answers what the Rambam is trying to say, and it makes things so beautiful and so clear. Now we're going to go a little bit into understanding this a little more with Isis of Chassidus. Then we'll go back to answer our question on Yerusha versus Matana. This also fits in with the explanation according to Chassidus. What's the difference between the first Kedusha and the second Kedusha? In the first time the Yidden went into Eretz Yisrael, overall the Yidden were on the level of Tzadikim. When they go in the second time, in the Madrege of Balei Tshuva, they were on the level of Balei Tshuva. Amongst the differences between Tzadikim and Balei Tshuva, the Veda of Tzadikim is primarily from above to below. Which means that they refine and elevate the below by overwhelming it with holiness from above. But the downside of this is that because it's coming from above and it's not something that is necessarily being internalized in the below, it's not so connected to the below, and therefore it's not permanent. If you can say, for example, you discipline a child by screaming at them, so the child gets afraid and they do what you want, but as soon as you turn around and look the other way, they're going to go back to their old ways because they weren't educated. They were just disciplined. Similarly, when the land was conquered from the other nations remained an entity. We were stronger than them. But then they strengthened themselves over us, and they were able to take the land back from us. Now, the same thing would apply in the person's Aveda. If the Yid doesn't engage with the world, and he hasn't been tested with something that came from the other side to tempt him in his Avodah, is nitakin Sicherheit, as there's no assurance that if he were to be tested, he'd be able to overcome it, because we don't know. On the other hand, the Baal Tshuva, his avodah, it comes from below. Where we refine the below so that it should become a fitting receptacle for holiness. And therefore, that's like educating the child instead of disciplining the child, where you change the child. Similarly, you're changing the below, that it should be able to contain and carry it elokus, and therefore it's in a way that it remains as vet nifsek, it doesn't stop. And again, let's use this metaphor in the person's avodah. Since he already engaged in the world and he already succumbed in certain things to go against the Eibishter's will, but now he's coming back, he's returning. to the Eibishter, to the Torah mitzvahs. Is das aber weiß, dass der Linie von Torah mitzvahs hat ihm durchgenommen und sehr viel, als euch der Durchfall kann ihm nicht wegreißen von dem Eibishter. This shows that when the second time he comes around, this shows that it permeated him so strongly that he can never be pulled away. Says sein Verbund mit dem Eibishter ist ständiger Art und his connection with the Eibishter is permanent and infinite. And this is in comparison to the second holiness of Israel. That even after we were exiled, Yidden can still come back. Nicht wie zu Alam, was darf in erst Käfer sein. Welcher Balein nicht zu sehen. Nur wie zu Alam, was gehört zu sehen, verständige Neufen. They went to Gullus for 70 years. When they come back, they don't have to conquer it. They just take it back because it's really theirs. Just like the Baal Tshuva. That is really connecting to something that is his. Once he refines himself and changes himself, then the connection is eternal. So, in addition to understanding the Rambam, that it makes sense what the Rambam is saying, that the first time is Kibush, the second time is Chazaka, this also is consistent with what is said in Pnimiyus HaTorah, that this is Tzadikim, this is Bali Tshuva, this is Milmayla Lamata, this is Milamata Lamayla, this is Yash La Hefsik technically, because it's only Milamayla, and this Ein La Hefsik because the Kli, the receptacle below was transformed. And now we can go back to the Ragachover. We can explain the connection between the first Kedusha, which was through Kibush, and the idea of Matana, which the Ragachover explained that it was Lazarachal Etein, or Lecha Etnena, and the second Kedusha, which was through Chazaka, which it says, Losses Lechol Rishta, it was a Yerusha. So you do as Yerusha Ein Lahefsik, Matana Yash Lahefsik. Yerusha has no interruption to it. Matana does. Meaning to say, once you take the Yerusha, it's yours forever. But a Matana could sometimes be reneged upon or something like that. The Tarot was Matana Yesh Lahefsek. Why is that? Even though the rule is that a person usually only gives a gift to someone who did something for him. Nevertheless, a present is not so much about what the recipient accomplished. It's more about the fact that the giver wants to give. And the recipient has no claim to it. And therefore, even after it was given, the giver can technically change his mind. When the father is at Inyan Matana, von is also to the Knesset, and therefore Matana is related to the first entry into Eretz Yisrael with Yeshua. Just like when they went in, they conquered it. It came from above. Just literally, that it was something that came from above. And also in Avedas Adam, it's something that it didn't change the person. It only was done because David said so. Similarly, the Eibusher gave it to us from above, and not because we took any ownership of it. The Eibusher, even though we did own it, but the Eibusher said in this case, I want kibush, and therefore the fact that we had an ownership to it didn't change anything. In Yerusha is the Chader. It's a demonstration that Yerusha is krevish al merish. But by Yerusha, the person is receiving it because he's the heir. He's related to the person that's leaving it. He has a claim to it. Because Amitis in Yerusha is as the Yerush is Etzem HaMerish. It says going to Yerusha, so that in Halacha we say that it's not even considered a transfer of ownership. The Yerusha, the Yerush, the heir, steps in to the space of the person who passed away, who person left it for them. It's not even considered a transfer. That's how connected the recipient is. Therefore, when it was given the second time around, it was in the way of Yerusha. When they go in, they went in not as conquerors, but they went in as owners, which means they have this intrinsic connection with Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, they were falling upon, so to speak, this intrinsic connection, this ownership, and therefore it's theirs. It's already theirs. There's nothing that you could do to take it away from them. And therefore, the kedusha is eternal. Stimmt, das in die Psukim. Das bekesset zum Inyan Matana Begdusha, die Schöne steht, der Loschen Zaracha Etin, und der Chat Nen, aber Loschen Asid, und Mishaycha zu Gdusha Schnee, der Loschen Zaracha, and Asat, Loschen Avar, which the Rebbe pointed out in the first seif, that by the Brisbane Absarim, which we're explaining here is talking about Kibbutz Sheni. He speaks B'Lashon Avar, and the first time around, which is the first kibbutz through Yeshua, he says B'Lashon Asid. Gushel Sheni is given a Farbund mit der Sheichas verliehen mit dem Land. Was hat sich gedacht? Erst auf dem Asid Kevis Nein Yisrael von der zweiten Rishus. This is not Kaddish. The first kedusha was dependent, as we just explained at length, by conquering the land, something that hadn't been done yet. They still had to go in and take it back from them, and therefore it's etin and etnena. It's going to happen in the future. There has to be a kibbutz first. Sheikh Kedusha Shnia is given the Eifen as Mitzer, Pu'ula Chazaka, haben sie bloß Megala given their Sheiches mit dem Land, as the Israel is theirs from freer, but the second Kedusha was not something they had to conquer. They were just revealing something that already, a pre-existent truth, that it was theirs already since the Abisha gave it to the Avos, to Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and therefore it says Nosati. It's in the past tense. It happened already. Already now, we're talking about the Kibbutz Sheni, the second time they go in, or the Kedusha Shnia rather, is Nasati Lashon Avar. It already happened. So all of the differences that the Rebbe pointed out in the beginning, the Avar, the Asad, the Matana, the Yerusha, and the fact that they didn't have to do anything beforehand, and the fact that Avram did something beforehand, all connects in very, very powerfully. The first kedusha was something that came through kibbutz, and therefore it has to be sad lashon asad, and it was a matana because it wasn't permanent, and something had to happen. Sorry, the last thing is take back that last thing. I'm mixing two things. Okay. Yud. The chilik zwischen matana and Yerush b'negeret Yisrael is kanal. Now Sif Yud is sort of a takeaway from this entire sikha, how it applies in the practical, and is very, very powerful, and is very, very connected to the time that we are in right now. Der Chilik zwischen Matana und Yerush b'negeret Yisrael is kanal blaze b'shaychas kedusha haaretz. Das hat sich aufgetan knisses Yisrael haaretz. We explained that this difference between the first entry and the second entry is only with regards to the kedusha. As the kedusha rishayna is gekven be'efesh Matana, und kedusha shnei zugekommen efel in Yerush v'sein lafsik. Very, very important. Even though we clarified this already, but we're clarifying this again, that this entire discussion is with regards to the kedusha of Yisrael. Aber die etzem bailus von Eden of Yisrael is ständig ganz betachas ashlemus. But the actual ownership of Yidden and Yisrael is complete and is total from von Zin der Eibishter das Land gegeben zu Avraham Avinu bis in the Besarim, from the point where the Eibishter gave it to Avraham Avinu als a nachlas elam and an eternal heritage. Was is a krisis bris is nicht shayach when it comes to a krisis bris, a covenant, a treaty is something that is eternal and can never be uprooted. Mamele is in dem nicht kein Unterschied in welchen matzev Eden gefinden sich, and there's no difference what situation is. I feel when says amatze from his nechatenu galinu meyatzenu. Even if because of our sins we were exiled from our land and we were distanced from our soil, is Eretz Yisrael eich demot artzenu and admasenu unser land und unser Erde remains ours. Our land, our soil, und wie der Eib Gvara sagt genau, as Eretz Yisrael muchzekesi, as we mentioned the name of the Yerushalmi before, that the Eretz Yisrael is ours, it's owned. Und Yerusha Yilchem Evesechem, Fun Avram Avinu, Chotz B'ntayim Ben Chet Egel Chet Meraglim, even though we sinned along the way, that never changed the reality that Eretz Yisrael is ours, it's owned, it's under our ownership. Und befragt ob ihr bevor Leil in dem Pesach in der Rambam. As in Yerusha is Eich Nimshech und Nikve Gevaran in Kedusha Aretz, Beifen as Eich die Kedusha Shnia in Lefsek Kitchel Losid Lovei. Especially as the Rambam explains, that even with regards to Kedusha, it's also ours. So there's two things going for us now. Number one, Bailus, ownership, started with Avraham Avinu, wasn't dependent on conquest. It wasn't dependent on anything. Once the Abisha gave it to Yidden, it belongs to Yidden forever. In addition to that, the Rambam explained that the second time we went in, it was B'derech Yerusha. And if it was B'derech Yerusha, it's Ein Lahefsek, it's eternal, there's no interruptions to that. Was der Fund ist verstandig. This is not something that we can argue about or negotiate about, or barter it, or exchange it for something. In addition to the fact that it's Israel with its full borders from Mitzrayim, from the Nile, all the way till Nahar Paros, to the top of Eretz Yisrael. is Yerusha to every Yid, when the fire can keiner chas v'shalom, and mevatas ein af achelik von Yisrael, no one is allowed to give up even one piece of Yisrael. Is there Wellen abgeben chas v'shalom av zach was geht gegen dem Ratzon Hashem, even the desire to give something away, going against the will of Hashem. Was birtzei nei nasna lanu, which the Eibusher gave it to us within His will. And this, of course, is the Rebbe referring to. Unfortunately, the various different times where Eretz Yisrael, the modern version of it, discussed or attempted, or even in some cases went ahead and gave away, so to speak, parts of Eretz Yisrael, says the Rebbe, you can't do that. It's going against the will of Hashem, who gave it to us, but even legally. But the Bailus of Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Yidden, and that can never be taken away from them. And even the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, as it is now, comes from a Yerusha in the time of Ezra, and a Yerusha ein lahefsik, and therefore there's nothing to talk about, there's nothing to negotiate about, there's nothing to exchange for. It belongs to the Yidden. And we didn't stand up to this with the proper strength. With the proper strength. Not, oh, look what we conquered, what we did, the strength of our hand, and therefore we have the right to now give it back. Chas v'shalom. But we stand with this proper strength, and this is our eternal heritage. From the Eibishter to the Ma'amelam. From the Eibishter, who's the eternal God, to the eternal nation, the eternal people, is mamatzliach in them. Then, if we stand with the proper strength, then we can be successful. Until we see the fulfillment of the promise that the nation, that their kings and their officers will be our servants, as Umas Elam helping the Yidden Usfin to Hashem Bechlal, und in Minyan now befrat noch bis Panagalos, that other nations will help the Yidden to fulfill the will of Hashem, and especially in this area of the not giving away land, even when we're still in Galus, because of course when Mashiach comes, it's irrelevant. But even in the time of Galus, where if we stand with the proper strength, we will see the other nations support us in this. When das Eil zu bis Mashiach, and this will hasten the coming of Mashiach, but then that guaranteed in Ganze Yisrael, which then even the other parts of Yisrael that are only going to become ours after Mashiach comes will then become ours. And then there will come a time when all the nations will speak very clearly to call out in the name of Hashem and to serve the Eibishter, everyone together. Very speedily nowadays. So what we see from over here is that the Bailus, the ownership of the Yidden, is not dependent on war. It's not dependent on conquest. It's not dependent on anything. The Eibishter gave it to us, and then it's us, and it's ours for eternity. And even the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, which the Eibishter at one point wanted it to be done through Kibush, but later on, there was a second entry, and there was a Yerusha, and the Yerusha, what it did is, it just revealed the fact that our Bailus, that our ownership has always been there, and that is eternal, and it's our job today to stand up strong for this ownership of Eretz Yisrael, for this Bailus of Eretz Yisrael, and for this Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, and not try to negotiate Chas v'Shalom or anything like that. And if we stand strong, then the Eibishter will see to it that even the other nations will help us, and it will bring about the time where it'll be revealed to the entire world that Eretz Yisrael belongs to us with the coming of Mashiach b'meheira v'yameinu mamash.